Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the fifth paragraph of the first chapter of the first book of von Vom Krige. The title is Utmost Exertion of Powers. So here we go, utmost exertion of powers. If we desire to defeat the enemy, we must proportion our force to his powers of resistance. This is expressed by the product of two factors which cannot be separated, namely, the sum of available means and the strength of the will. The sum of the available means may be estimated in a measure, as it depends, although not entirely, upon numbers, but the strength of volition is more difficult to determine, and can only be estimated to a certain extent by the strength of the motives. Granted we have obtained in this way an approximation to the strength of the power to be contended with, we can then take of our own means and either increase them so as to obtain a preponderance, or, in case we have not the resources to effect this, then do our best by increasing our means as far as possible. But the adversary does the same. Therefore, there is a new mutual enhancement which, in pure conception, must create a fresh effort towards an extreme. This is the third case of reciprocal action and a third extreme with which we meet. Third, reciprocal action. So as you understand, this goes on with what we have read in previous paragraphs and introduces the utmost exertion of powers and the third, reciprocal action. So von Clausewitz is saying here that if we really desire to defeat our enemy, which should be a fair objective, we really must proportion our force to his powers of resistance. So this is particularly important for several reasons, because it can be summed up, however, in a sort of an economical, a literally economical perspective. So not just most of the times we risk to be defeated, so we have to look at the enemy and say, okay, fundamentally, how much can this resist? Resist in this sense, not, it's both passively and actively, it's really have to understand how many how much this enemy can go on fundamentally. And this is useful not just because of the threat naturally that the enemy is posing on us, so the ability to continue fighting and the resilience and so on, but also because we have to organize ourselves. We have to count effectively on how many energies we can spare. We have to consider all the time whether this act of violence that war is and to which we're going to engage is worth the cost that really always exists in real war. So the powers of resistance is expressed by the product, von Clausewitz says, of two factors which cannot be separated. So these are: one, the sum of available means; two, the strength of the will. Then von Clausewitz explains what these are. So the first one, the sum of the available means, may be estimated, von Clausewitz says, in a measure, as it depends, although not entirely, upon numbers. This is particularly interesting because it shows you that objectively resources are kind of a physical thing. You can quantify the means, which in here are not just are really everything that concerns physics. You can talk about these means even in energy, fundamentally, in joule, if you want, because that's the available resources that you have. And therefore you can quantify it, which is not extremely easy, but naturally in the real praxis of war, more or less what means you're going to employ fundamentally, what's your autonomy into this, and you can make a relatively fair estimate about the amount of resources that you can access. Although von Clausewitz here says this the sum of available means only doesn't entirely depend upon numbers, meaning that you may have certain resources, but it's really I'm not entirely sure whether von Clausewitz is referring to this now, but the point is that even if you technically have some resources, you may not be able to access them at all times. As you understand, you cannot access them fully. This is true because of attrition that we will see in von Clausewitz's theory, and how important that is. That can derive from the fact that during the war things are gonna go bad for some reason, not just because the enemy is actively destroying you and maybe your own resources, not just in combat, but maybe also at the source of these resources as well. Also because in this sense you can lack availability of resources. You may have a sum of resources, but some of them are not enough to make other resources to be accessed. So this is naturally very complicated. It's something that pertains in fact to strategy, that normally is way more complicated, I mean all the time I would say, that than tactics. I would say that war, I mean, you know, probably wars are countries go to war, everything is much more fluid than it seems, at least in when everything is prepared, in the sense that great difficulties are usually overcome. Some are not, obviously, at all times. There is attrition, in fact, in the middle, so never goes as really as planned. But the real problem at that point is also what can happen later, fundamentally. And that's also why von Clausewitz stresses that the sum of available means and the strength of will cannot be separated, because also the availability of resources is theoretical sometimes. So you can theoretically quantify these resources. Maybe von Clausewitz also stresses the fact that you can't really always quantify literally everything that is in your hand. You also have, you know, need some administration, some organization, some way of reckoning fundamentally what your resources are, even just physically speaking. But way more complicated, von Clausewitz says, is the strength of will, because he says, but the strength of volition is more difficult to determine and can only be estimated to a certain extent by the strength of the motives. This is particularly important because we have seen that in war there is fundamentally, I mean, this corresponds, this division between the sum of available means and the strength of motives, I think can in part have to do with the hostile intention and, let's say, the availability of physical strength fundamentally, and the hostile intention, making a parallelism with these other elements in von Clausewitz's theory. So you may have all this physical strength, but you may have not the will to fight, or let's say better, that sometimes the will to fight that moves constantly, it changes constantly. Paradoxically, resources are something that, yeah, you maybe can be cut off from in a certain situation, but they're always there. They don't run away. You may lose control of them in some fashion, but they can still fundamentally, you know, be used. The strength of will is kind of different, because will is first of all, much more difficult to assess in itself. I mean, um, it's very difficult to think about the complexity of human psyche. Every time you do something, you quite rarely are 100% sure what you're doing. I mean, your mind is always in a kind of theoretically a sort of alert state, for which that's the reason why you're alive fundamentally, because even when you do something relatively simple or something relatively easy, because you need that moment, you're not quite fully 100% sure what you're doing, and this can really change brutally depending on so many factors, and therefore it's much less easy to quantify. Also because your mind fundamentally condition itself, and how many times do you change idea? And you can understand that if this is so problematic for even the will of an individual, how this how this overly complicated it gets when we talk about entire nations that go at war, and all the inner division, the attrition also in here, in the in the will, in the divergency fundamentally of the divergence, sorry, of in the disagreement, you can sum up. So here von Clausewitz says that the only way you can partly estimate the strength of will is fundamentally by the strength, by a certain extent, only by the strength of the motives. This is particularly important even from a strictly military historical perspective, because how many times do we debate fundamentally why did a certain war started? I mean, just think about think about World War the First. I mean, it's a big, deep historical, but even philosophical question why World War the First broke out. It's not just because Francis Ferdinand was killed in Sarajevo, and then the whole thing and followed just by a set of diplomatical mechanisms. Obviously, there were so many factors that are in their ensemble very difficult to decipher fundamentally. What was the most important factor that brought to that, even in perspective? And I'm not talking now just from a third-person perspective. You may have doubts essentially about what you did yourself by taking a decision. I mean, do you really remember why, 10 years ago you did something? Can you remember, what were your motivations, your will, your strength? And maybe not just something you have lost memory of, but something maybe that was very important for you, and that maybe you reevaluate or you mystify or kind of reassess in a certain sense at this time distance, because maybe you think that you know better yourself, and the time you remember something that it wasn't quite the same reason. So that's why von Clausewitz stresses the difficulty in determining the strength of volition, because it's very difficult to assess even from a strictly quantitative point of view. It's like von Clausewitz says before about these resources. Those are theoretically, physical resources. You can have problems for accessing them, but they stay there. The strength of will is something extremely difficult to quantify, to understand in the first place. So von Clausewitz goes on, says, granted we have obtained in this way an approximation to the strength of the power to be contended with, we can then take of our own means and either increase them so to obtain preponderance, or, in case we have not the resources to effect this, then do our best by increasing our means as far as possible. So it's interesting in here that von Clausewitz is starting from the perspective of assessing fundamentally the enemy power of resistance. He's not even talking about, I mean, obviously this is valuable for, this is valid for both contendants. We're explaining now these reciprocal actions that always exist in war in this sense from one side and another, so it's perfectly speculative. So this is like a method, because it tells you literally what you should do in this context. So what he's saying is that you should calibrate always the use of your of your force to the strength of your power, let's say, on the base of the strength of the enemy power, on the enemy's strength of power, say better. So this is very logical, as you understand, because you don't go out there fighting someone you don't even know who is or how can react. So there is always this situation of assessment for which you should calibrate your power on the base of what the enemy one is. So here von Clausewitz says, given that now you have approximated, you have an approximated idea of the strength of the enemy strength, the strength of the enemy power, then you can start acting on your own means instead, so that you can increase them in order to obtain preponderance. Or in the case we have not the resources to affect this, then to do our best by increasing our means as far as possible. So as we've seen from the previous paragraphs, what you have to obtain is preponderance, because you have to ensure fundamentally that the enemy is kept by you under a pressure from which he basically cannot escape. It's like a grip fundamentally, and whose objective is to make the enemy give up fundamentally and to surrender, because what you're trying to impose on him is fundamentally greater than more damaging, more harming for him than what what you're demanding to him to surrender. Naturally, this entails in part that the enemy reaction is based on also on the on the type of a demand that you're doing. Obviously, if you are trying to compel the enemy to fulfill your own will, and this request is kind of very heavy, well, at that point you're giving less reasons to accept your condition, and you may face in fact a higher resistance from the side of the enemy, if this enemy naturally has enough resources to do it, and always given that he is going to fight in some way, which might not even happen. But this is important, because it's like when you take away the enemy the opportunity to even to surrender. At that point you may unleash a fight to the death that is definitely not very convenient even from your side, so that you will not get to disarm that enemy, if not when you have killed him, and that's gonna take a lot fundamentally. So this is just a digression, but I'm throwing in an example to make you understand fundamentally what we're talking about concretely. So you always have to obtain this preponderance. Then it's von Clausewitz says you may not have this kind of preponderance. So if you don't have the resources to effect this, then you should do our best to increase your means as far as possible. This is important because it naturally presents the opportunity, which is real at all times, to extend your means. That is fundamentally to to increase your power at that point, and therefore as far as possible, as von Clausewitz says. So this rereading it means this distinction is very important, because there is a limit beyond which you obtain preponderance effectively. So you're in a condition in which you can really impose the enemy your conditions in some way, or at least excuse me, you can keep the enemy under pressure and keeping it under. But this might not be the case all the time. Actually, most of the times, this is how it really happens, given that your efforts may be also limited in nature by politics, so that the act of violence is not enough to reach that preponderance. So it's obvious that in this case you should try, you shouldn't give up, because you may not be preponderant but you on the enemy to keep it under pressure, but you let's say excuse me, let me think about it. You may still be well, okay, no, I don't think so. I think there is not really this limit, because either you're preponderant or not. What only changes is the degree, fundamentally, of the energy resources consumption at this point. That really makes the problem. So here I don't really follow the point, but I believe that obviously if you're not preponderant, so you're in the condition in which you are under pressure, given the second and the first and second reciprocal actions von Clausewitz talks about, you should at least increase your means as far as possible if you're going to continue to fight, fundamentally, so that you can maybe hope that although the enemy in that moment is preponderant, you still can maximize the damage to him, and render him, for some reason, inconvenient to keep on fighting. And von Clausewitz reminds you, once again, quite evidently, that the adversary is doing the same. So you're not the only one. This is particularly important because it's not really a matter of decision. I mean, at this point, this is really literally what is going on. At least in theory, in the sense that, as we've seen, if at least the use of violence entails this by chance, then you can limit violence, you can modify and control it, but the result is that the enemy is always reacting to you from the other side, is trying to achieve fundamentally the same identical thing. So here, von Clausewitz says, therefore, there is a new mutual enhancement which, in pure conception, so always in theory, must create a fresh effort towards an extreme. This is the third case of reciprocal action and a third extreme with which we meet. Third reciprocal action. So, summing up, these reciprocal actions always tend to an extreme. The first one, as we have seen, as one side dictates the law to the other, there arises a sort of reciprocal action which logically must, this was about the act of violence pushed to its utmost bounds. The second reciprocal action is as long as the enemy is not defeated, he may defeat me. Then I shall be no longer my own master. He will dictate the law to me as I did to him. And this is the other case, that fundamentally you have to increase your means, so to obtain a preponderance on the enemy, or at least by increasing your means as far as possible if you can't, so the adversary does the same, and therefore this is new mutual enhancement, which, at least in pure conception, must create a fresh effort towards the extreme. So, and this is the third reciprocal action. So I believe that these last 3 chapters show how there is fundamentally a constant relation between the 2 fighters that affects them both in a way or another, always pushes towards an extreme in theory, because if this was a merely military affair with no interference from the outside, which is unrealistic because this never happens, the objective of these 2 wrestlers in their duel is to basically make the other one obeying, to compel the others to fulfill the other's will, fundamentally. And this means that this is a very powerful consideration, because it practically means you can't escape from this system. There may be occasions in which you can, of course, bail out, but in the moment in which you use the act of violence, this is what is going on all the time. So it can go more or less on, let's say, given the circumstances, but this is the nature of the fight. And this is fundamentally the inescapable condition in which you find yourself, and you have to cope with without any hope to do otherwise, because this is really how it happens. It's not how you decide it to be. It's how, at least in theory, the system works, the game works. Alright, so this paragraph was relatively short, so I also added a bit because I like to make some decently long video, but yeah, so we will go, I don't know whether tomorrow we'll make another video about von Clausewitz, maybe I'll have the time to prepare something else. Nevertheless, okay, we'll simply go on. The next paragraph is on the modification in the reality. Then there are very meaningful paragraphs that we will read. Okay, so just for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.